Hello and welcome. This is our new series, Straight from the Source, where we have a chance to expand on material we've already covered in scripted videos and have guests on and
Yeah, that'll be cool.
talk about topics in a more relaxed setting. And after our last video on psychedelics, we realized immediately that we needed this series because there was a lot of material that we just couldn't put in. And I
Yeah, it's
know
hard to fit everything in such a short window.
it is, and I know that you have quite a bit of material. I did a lot of research too, but mostly out of just interest. But I know you have a lot that you want to talk about, and I think before we dive into it, we should do a quick disclaimer. It's important, and it doesn't have to take long.
Yeah. Well, we also gave the disclaimer in the scripted video, but we just want
Yeah.
to say that both myself and Susan and the Hyperion source and Hyperionism as a whole, we don't condone doing anything dangerous or illegal. And when we're going through this expansion on psychedelics, which is today's title for our video, we don't want to try and romanticize the psychedelic experience or recommend that anybody take psychedelics. We're just wanting to talk about the information because it's really exciting and interesting. All the stuff that we've researched, we kind of want to bring that information to you, stuff that we couldn't fit in the video.
Yeah, and I think yeah, it's important for people to remember that you can do this just out of interest. That's what a lot of what we researched was just really interested in it. Let's why don't you start out? I know that you have the bulk of information that you want to give that you weren't able to talk about. Why don't you just start off with some common uses?
Yeah, so in the scripted video, we talked a lot about the history of psychedelics and the interaction with consciousness, but we didn't really talk a lot about the scenarios and settings in which people actually take psychedelics. So I thought of a few different scenarios, and there could be more than this, but a lot of the more familiar ones that you see, number one is the party environment.
Mhm.
It's kind of more of a social environment. You see people at raves or concerts or festivals partaking in psychedelics and wanting to have that experience with others. And then on the flip side of that, you have kind of the more recreational approach where people may take psychedelics alone in their home or with a friend or two. And you might think of that scenario as kind of the getting high and having a good time, which is the same for the party environment recreationally. On the other side of that, you also have people who their main intent is to experience a spiritual journey. They
Mhm.
have a directed goal to kind of get something out of the experience rather than just kind of take it as a party drug and flow with the experience. So sometimes those categories of intent, they kind of overlap. So it's not to say that somebody who their first purpose is to experience a spiritual journey doesn't also want to, feel the highs and have a good time when they're doing that spiritual journey. And also people in the party environment or doing psychedelics recreationally, they may also want to have a spiritual journey with their experience. So those circles kind of overlap, but there are different scenarios in which people partake, if you will. So when we're talking about these different scenarios of people taking psychedelics and embarking in the psychedelic experience, it kind of makes me think of the American writer Hunter S. Thompson, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Susan, because you're very much into literature. But he has a quote from one of his books that is, "Buy the ticket, take the ride."
Oh yeah.
And I think of that with the psychedelic experience. And I think also people treat psychedelics as a ticket, not only as a free ticket to enlightenment or a shortcut to wisdom, what have you. But they also kind of treat it like a theme park. When you get in there and you're having the psychedelic experience, there's a lot of things to be in awe of, a lot of different colors and
Mhm.
trippy designs and things that you're seeing. You're in awe of the colors and the bright lights. You kind of get swept away with the experience, and there's no goals, no direction that you're kind of aiming for. You're just there to have the experience and ride the ride, if you will. So there's not really any understanding of the conscious experience and what you're experiencing during this psychedelic trip. So I also wanted to talk about kind of the broad purpose of what it means, what the psychedelic experience means. So when I'm talking about goals, some people tend to have transcendental goals. What they want to do is they want to encounter something profound, but they also want to be changed by it. And so what do I mean by that? When you take psychedelics, you're kind of pushing yourself and your borders of your comfort zones, and you're witnessing and experiencing something new. It's something different than the way your conscious experience is in the normal world when you're just out and about,
Mm.
living life as a human. And so psychedelics, I talked about this a little bit in our scripted video, they can bring emotional or spiritual or physical healing, but they can also help you bring back some insight or
Mhm.
transformative ideas. And that's kind of the purpose of these transcendental goals that people have when they want to embark on the psychedelic experience. And in our scripted video, I mentioned a quote from Terence McKenna where he talks about a metamorphosis of the self. I think the quote goes, "We are ontologically edge walking
Oh, yeah.
on what it means to be human." And I love that. And I love Terence McKenna as a writer and as a thinker because he had such a great way of poetically describing his experiences. And when you listen to him speak, you really kind of are not only extremely interested, but you want to learn more and you want to hear him speak more because the way that he describes things is so amazing. So Terence McKenna says that when we embark on these psychedelic experiences, we become like fishermen and we are going out onto the dark ocean of the mind. And what we're doing is we're throwing our nets down into that dark sea that we're unfamiliar with, and we are fishing for ideas, whether or not we're consciously aware that that's what we're doing. And so what Terence would say is that we're not after some kind of behemoth idea that will tear through your net and drag your boat down into the depths of those waters. But also on the flip side of that, you're not looking for tiny sardine sized ideas that will slip through the holes of your net and that they disappear. What you are is you're hoping for some kind of middle sized idea. And that sounds really weird to think of ideas in terms of sizes of small or medium or large. But what you want is ideas that are not so small that they're trivial. I think Terence says one trivial idea is during a psychedelic experience, realizing that the tip of your pinky fits perfectly into the hole of your nostril. It's perfectly sized for that. What purpose does that
Right.
serve?
Right.
But you're also not looking for ideas that are so large that they're incomprehensible. Being completely destroyed by an idea that you can't describe or put into words, something that has no purpose to you because it's
Mhm.
incomprehensible. So what we're doing is we're looking for middle-sized ideas that we can wrestle back into our boat and take back to shore and share with
Mhm.
humanity. We are looking to bring back new ideas that will not only be great for us as individuals, but great for the collective. And so Terence says that our world is endangered by an absence of good ideas and the absence of consciousness. So when we're going out onto that dark ocean of the mind, we're reaching down into the darkness of the depths that we are unconscious of and bringing those ideas into our consciousness back onto shore and sharing that with other people by
I love
describing
that.
our experiences. I do
I love
too.
that.
It's really a beautiful analogy. And what he's saying is we're bringing back small pieces of the picture and contributing to the new paradigm of mind, whether or not we are aware that we're doing that. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about that analogy. And I love everything Terence McKenna does.
Yeah, you
But
had,
when
I'm
we,
gonna I'm gonna interrupt you and just tell you that on that, uh I've seen a bunch of his videos, but you had told me about this quite
yeah,
long one about the plants, which I thought was so interesting. Excuse me. And I really loved how he explains the history of all over the world. He just takes you all over the world, telling you what plants are where and who is using them. And you can just listen to him. He's so easy. He's so interesting, and he just keeps going and drawing you in. So
yeah.
I'm going to put that video in the description below in case anybody wants to watch that one. Thank you
Yeah,
for
for
recommending that.
anybody that's interested, that is a lecture of Terence McKenna's called "Sacred Plants as Spirit Guides."
Mhm.
It's quite long; it's about 3 hours, maybe 3.5 hours,
Yeah,
but it's really full of information because not only does he talk about his experiences, he also brings philosophy into that and history and the goals of what we want to do with psychedelics in the future. And we'll talk about that a little bit later
yeah.
coming up. So that's one of the reasons that I really love listening to Terrence McKenna talk about his experiences, because he can so accurately convey the complexity of the psychedelic experience.
Mhm.
So, for anybody who's familiar with psychedelics or who has done them or heard somebody else speaking about them, you know that it can probably be overwhelmingly rich in psychological phenomena. You experience all the different phases and different colors and things like that. So you can imagine that it's probably easy to be swept away with the experience. Not only is there a lot to remember, but trips can sometimes last a very long time, many hours in some cases. And so you can probably almost think of the psychedelic experience like a dream. When you go to bed and you dream at night, upon waking, it's hard to articulate the different things that you experienced because they can be strange, but also because the longer you are out of that experience, those details kind of fade and you have a hard time with your recall of being able to recall what you just experienced. And so I think definitely the psychedelic experience can be hard to articulate, not only the imagery and perceptions, but in terms of the conscious experience as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you wake up from a dream, and even though it was very vibrant, this happens to me a lot, very vibrant, very, busy, uh, just trying to grasp it. It's like trying to grasp smoke. It just dissipates. And maybe you're only
Yeah, that's a
left with
good way of putting it, trying to grasp smoke.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't make that up. I've heard that before, but other people use it. But it is really, really like that, and it's interesting because just in the past couple of nights, I've had a couple of those, and it was I just know that they were very meaningful, and I can only picture a couple of like very, very minor visuals, and I know there was so much wrapped up in that, and I'm imagining that this is probably very similar. It can be probably pretty frustrating.
Yeah, definitely. So when we're talking about the complexity of the psychedelic experience, that also brings us to the responses that people have when they're trying to convey their psychedelic experience. Because when people come out of it and they're trying to tell others or share what they've just witnessed or experienced, it's very much a broad scale because some people can be on the very emotional side,
Mhm.
excuse me, or they can be on the very rational thinking side about the conscious experience side of that. So, in some of the different responses that you hear sometimes that are more on the emotional end of the scale, you hear people saying things like, I was raising my vibrations,
Mhm.
excuse me, or the universe is love, different things that they
Oh yeah, that's
felt
common.
and they feel very close to. That's very common. And so you can think that the experience is very clouded by emotional response because you're being triggered during your psychedelic experience. And you can probably also think of it as like a quasi religious experience, which definitely reflects the ancient spirituality of our ancestors that I talked about in our scripted video,
Mhm.
interacting with different divine powers. And that's the whole purpose of the psychedelic experience for our ancestors. They were doing this to contact divinities or higher forms of consciousness or gods or their ancestors, whatever you want to think of it as or interpret the history as. But it definitely needs to be interpreted and analyzed with critical thinking and reason and logical thinking because there is something to be gained from the psychological experience.
Yeah, that's the integration process, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but also to be able to integrate and be able to properly analyze these different substances, these psychoactive plants and different psychedelics, we also have to end the stigma of
Yeah.
psychedelics. And that's a huge part of it because, as you know, and I'm sure you've witnessed a little bit more of this than me, just on a generational side of things, you saw probably more of the war of drugs,
Oh yeah, the war on drugs. Yeah.
all of the propaganda with the just say no ads
Mhm.
and kind of all of psychedelics all of a sudden being lumped into the highest tier of dangerous drugs like
Yeah.
heroin and all of those different drugs that are schedule 1.
Yeah. Actually, I don't know about heroin, but I know like Coke is Schedule 2, I believe. It was when
Yeah.
I just looked that up, and to see all of these um, like LSD and mushrooms, psilocybin, to be in, they thought Schedule 1 was there's no reason to take these. that's why they got put there. And
Yeah, no medical benefits.
yeah, and we're going to get to a lot of now that there's new research, and there's so much actually that we can get out of them. Um, but
It's
but
crazy
yeah,
because in the 50s, like we talked about in our scripted video, there was so much research
yes,
and it was being, driven by a lot of different people as beneficial. And
yes.
then all of a sudden, the entire
Well,
dialogue switched on it.
my take on that is because it happened, the 60s came, and then early 70s, I think, is when Nixon signed um, the Get Rid of Drugs Act. What was
Yeah.
that? What was that called? The Controlled Substances Act.
Yeah.
And I think that was early 70s. And but what had happened in the 60s, you go from a very sort of what we would consider a very conservative lifestyle, and then it was like in this video that I think was one of the ones I put through in the description for our scripted video, where this researcher, it's Matthew, forget his last name. Is it Matthew Johnson? He did the interview with Lex Friedman.
Yeah, Lex Friedman. He's cool.
And this was the first one I had seen, and I'll talk about it a bit more. It's very long, but worthwhile watching. I hope that you'll see it. But I think his name is Matthew Johnson, and he's a professor and psychedelic researcher at Johns Hopkins. And I was watching a different video that I put through last time. It's much shorter. And he said, look at the Beatles before LSD and look at the Beatles after LSD. And it was that change, I think, that society found very disturbing, that they looked at it and said, this is what drugs are doing. These are what these drugs are doing to our society. This is frightening. The kids are out of control, kind of thing. And I think that had a lot to do with it, where they shut down all of the research very fast. And it had been quite a lot.
I think a lot of that was driven not only by misinformation, but also fear and propaganda and shame.
Definitely.
Because, for all of these conservative families that are seeing their children do these psychedelic substances for the first time, all these different drugs and psychoactive plants, things that they don't have awareness or education of, or even any kind of perception on, they all of a sudden thought that their kids were destroying their minds and destroying society. And it was kind of a huge taboo.
Yeah, and advocating for peace and anti-racism and burning their bras. Yeah, you can imagine that, people were like, no, we don't want that, that's all the good stuff that you get from these substances. So, you can imagine how they must have found that very frightening, that what is happening to our world, we don't like it. But anyway, I think the research now that we're getting into is going to make a huge change. And
I think we're definitely going into a new positive direction, where we're seeing new applications for these different substances, psychedelic, psychedelic drugs and psychoactive plants and stuff. And especially in the field of mental health, you see a lot of stuff for PTSD, anxiety, and depression, and addiction too.
Oh yeah. And it's huge. In fact, one of the other videos that I watched last time, and again, I'll put it in the description below here, was a panel of 3 people. I talked to you about this because of the middle person was Reggie from, I can't remember his last name, who is
Reggie Watts.
Yes. And he's from the late James Corden Late Show. And I had seen him before, I just didn't know his name. And then 2 others, a neuroscientist also from Johns Hopkins, and a researcher from MAPS. I think he's the is he the founding director from MAPS? Hang on, because I have it here. Rick Doblin, and he was very interesting. Yeah, he's the founder and executive director of MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies in California. And he was very interesting. And speaking of research, his team is in the final stages of, and I believe it's MD and MDMA for depression, for some kind of mental health. I think it's depression or anxiety, PTSD in that area, and they're very close to going to FDA approval. I mean, it's not going to be tomorrow, but
that'll be really interesting.
It's coming,
to see, though.
Yeah. And then the other person, the one from Johns Hopkins, she was a professor in neuroscience. She made amazing, groundbreaking discovery in mice, but of a new window being opened in the critical time frame for learning something. And we know that with our brain, in plasticity, our brains, once you've missed that critical window, it's kind of like you're hooped. And this is, yeah. And like for language, for example, there's a critical time period for learning language and for learning, I think, like motor skills, things like that. And when you miss that, it's not as though you can just pick it up later. And they discovered that, and this is also, I believe, MDMA. Yes, MDMA can reopen a new critical time window. And if they can transfer that to be applied to humans, that will be amazing. So it's still really early, but hugely exciting news on the research front. And I was just looking up research just in general, psychedelic research. And if you do that, if you just Google that, you can see everywhere that studies are being done. Universities have departments in it. So it's really exciting. And
I know that there is a popular mycologist named Paul Stamets. He's kind of a mushroom researcher who's been doing a lot of studies about psilocybin activating different portions of the brain, like what you were talking about. But he's also looking into pairing that with different mushrooms, such as lion's mane, which in his research and studies have shown to actually regrow a substance on the synapses of the brain called myelin, which helps with interconnectivity, electrical impulses. And
it regrows it?
It actually regrows that myelin on the synapses of the brain, at least in his studies. That would have to be verified with definite research, but he's a very interesting person to look into as well, Paul Stamets. And so that actually the two different fungi paired together, psilocybin and lion's mane, actually makes it so that the brain can have better connectivity and electrical impulses, which is really promising for dementia and all of those different things. So I think what the really beautiful thing about all this new research is we're seeing a cultural and societal shift in acceptance. So we're kind of seeing the stigma start to break. There's still stigma there for sure, but we're starting to see, decriminalization in certain areas. Before it was California and just Denver. And I think you mentioned now it's 11 states that are working.
11 states have some kind of psychedelic like legislature going through in 2023. And I think that's going to snowball, because
I think so too.
One of the things that I was also looking up is just the society's, like interest in not just for research, but just in psychedelics. And I found an article in Forbes and an article just in capitalism, the ventures, things to look into. And they both are talking about psychedelics as an area that's going to be huge. Like people are already looking ahead to, what's going to happen. And you just get the idea that once these studies go through, once they realize the help people can get, I absolutely envision in the future places where you can go and say, this is my issue, and they will be able to say, this is what you should do. In fact,
Safe spaces, basically.
yeah, safe spaces. And this is the other person that I mentioned it with the Lex Matthew Johnson, who was being interviewed in a podcast with Lex Friedman. And Lex actually said it was one of the most interesting ones he had done, one of the most interesting podcasts, and I think it's over 3 hours. It's long, but if you skip to the different timestamps that you're interested in, you can maybe just focus on those areas. But I highly recommend it. I know that you'll really enjoy it. Matthew Johnson is very interesting to talk about. He did a shorter one that I put in the description before, but this one in here, he talks at length about how he envisions the future. And he said, we're with the studies that we're doing, and he's very much a radical, self-called radical empiricist. But in this case, this is something where it's benefiting people because there's lots of scientific method that helps. I think people often think that in Hyperionism, we think that that's a bad thing. It isn't. It's just not something to be used in the foundational information.
I think one of the interesting things that we will also see is not only research into the therapeutic benefits, but also what I'm really interested in is understanding the psychological phenomena. There's so many different questions on what we are actually experiencing within the mind that I want to see expanded on. And that kind of brings up a lot of different questions, questions about the psychedelic experience. I know in one of Morg's live streams, they talked about out-of-body experiences.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was very brief. It was just brought up in passing. But that also brings up the question of, with out-of-body experiences, are we experiencing an internal experience that has been created in our mind for us? Or are we actually tapping into an external realm? With DMT, a lot of people say that they're going into the DMT realm. Is that part of the collective unconscious?
Yeah.
Are the dimensions that we experience, the entities and the interactions that we have with these aliens or, jesters or what have you, are those archetypes of the unconscious that each of us have within us that we are experiencing? Or is that actual contact that we're making with higher forms of consciousness? Those are really great questions, but I imagine they would be so hard to actually get to the bottom of.
I'm right there with you on finding that fascinating. In fact, years ago when I started watching, I don't think I knew about DMT directly. I was finding a lot of videos years ago on ayahuasca because people were going to South America, and I loved watching people relate their stories because the life change that went on. People, they couldn't wait to get home and film themselves talking about their experiences. And one woman actually, she said, "I'm packing because I'm moving there." And I remember thinking, wow, that's profound. That's a massive life change. She said, "It's absolutely
huge dedication."
Yeah, she said, it just absolutely changed my life. So I was fascinated by that. And I watched a lot of videos of people's accounts of being on ayahuasca, but it brings up a lot of questions because you want to know, what is this that they're describing? And one of the things I found fascinating was when somebody describes something that they've experienced and they're telling it to somebody else. And this happened with one woman I was watching, and this person said, "Oh, I've been there. I've been in that temple pyramid."
Yeah,
you're describing
similarity in experiences.
And in the video with Matthew Johnson, the professor and Lex, when they had the discussion, they talked about a lot of this. It's near the end, so definitely get to that part. He asked him, Matthew, if it was if he believed that they were aliens. So, and I think that's a common question. And also, I think that they discussed is it just, are we exploring our mind, or are we going to a shared place? Are we, which one is it? Or is it some of both, or whatever? And I find that like really, really interesting. What I don't know is why, when they know about these experiences, has nobody said, we have to start studying this right now, like
Yeah, you would
seriously, to
think that
find
people
out.
would want to jump on it
You would think so.
because,
Yeah.
it's so interesting to think, will these studies and all this research, will it bring us to a better understanding of consciousness as we know it, or even our place in reality and how we interact with reality as eternal minds, you know?
Well, Matthew Johnson talks about, um, I'm sure this was in the podcast one. He talks about some of the things that Morg has talked about, where he envisions in the future we're going to be going a lot more internal, and even to the point where you can take something, you can take a substance and then live like 1,000 years, experience 1,000 years within your one lifetime. Yeah, it's really,
That's
really,
almost a little scary.
it's a little freaky. Yeah, he's definitely up for researching that for sure.
Yeah. But
And
it also brings the question, when we're talking about how much it'll change the way we understand reality, it also brings the question, can psychedelics cause a paradigm shift in terms of our human compassion and interconnectedness too? Because we see a lot of horrible things going on in the world in the way that
yeah,
we treat each other. One of the main goals of Hyperionism is to work towards unity. And it
mhm,
begs the question, are these substances kind of a key to shifting our consciousness in terms of how we think of each other, think of ourselves, think of Earth, how we treat the
yeah.
Earth? And I think yes, for sure.
Oh,
But
me
I think
too.
definitely it has to be guided by professionals and
Yeah,
researched to the fullest extent. But I think definitely it's
yeah.
promising.
I think so too, because the plethora of descriptions, that the stories that people say when they come back, and it's not just the, oh, everything is love thing, but it's that experience of unity, of knowing there's something more than just what, every man out for himself kind of thing that we experience here. It changes people, and in fact, that's one of the things that Matthew Johnson said, even in people who are like my age, one experience, just one, can offer a profound, permanent change in the way someone views reality and their existence. So I don't see how this won't be something that, especially as it starts to become more and more common. I mean, it's coming that they're going
Yeah.
to start using this to help people, and to get away from a lot of the harmful things that people do. And I think,
Yeah, and even though we've been talking for this straight from the source episode about how great psychedelics can be and how great the research is, it
yeah,
also brings the question that many people probably ask when watching this video is, are psychedelics required for the expansion of consciousness? People watching this may be asking themselves, do I need to do psychedelics to get to what these guys are talking about, meaning you and I? And the answer is definitely no. And we also said that in our scripted video, that psychedelics are definitely not required for the expansion of consciousness. And given back to our disclaimer that I gave at the beginning of this video, we're not trying to romanticize this
right.
or recommend psychedelics to everybody. You don't have to, and there's no pressure to. And, what we're talking about is ending the stigma, for positive benefits and applications in ways that can change the world and change humanity in great ways, working
Yeah.
towards unity, understanding consciousness and psychedelic phenomena. And all of those are really interesting, and you don't have to be interested in it. You don't have to do psychedelics, but we're just putting that information out there for the people that do want to know
Well,
more.
if some, for whatever reason, people don't want to do it, and that's perfectly fine, and there are some people who can't, given conditions that they have, or they just don't want to, and that's perfectly valid. But you can still look at research material, you can see results, and you can listen to people's stories, what they're saying about it. You don't have to do
Yeah,
it yourself.
it's perfectly okay to support without doing it yourself.
Absolutely.
You know?
And I think just, keeping up with what is being discovered
Yeah.
is all that you would have to do. You absolutely don't have to actually experience it yourself. Of course, people can do what they want to do. But anyway, I think it's absolutely fascinating to me. I like hearing about what the new research is, and watching to see how the different states and countries around the world, how they are responding to it. And I think it's going
Yeah.
to happen really fast. So is there anything else you wanted to add, or?
No, I think we've provided a lot of information today, and there will be the links to all of the
Yeah,
videos that we talked about
yeah,
in the description of this video. And you can probably look forward to us doing many more videos, not necessarily on psychedelics, and we may even have guests on in the
yep,
future talking about different topics. So thank you for watching today.
yeah. Yeah, and one last thing before we go, just people are welcome to put ideas for other topics that you'd like to see discussed on the Hyperion Source. Just put them in the comments below.